What happens when punk rock music and Islam collide?
For David Coolidge, it meant a journey of self-discovery, faith, and scholarship.
From his early days in Chicago to his pursuit of a PhD in Islamic studies,
David's journey is one that will change your assumptions about what it means to be a Muslim in America.
Welcome to the Journey Towers podcast with your hosts M. Hadi and Alya Matkar.
My name is Robert David Coolidge. I go by David. It's a family tradition. And I was born in Chicago, Illinois, and now I live in Oakland, California. Moved out here to do my PhD in Islamic studies, but I converted to Islam back in 1998 when I was in college in Rhode Island at Brown University, and I had first been introduced to Islam in Chicago, where I grew up, by two guys in the Chicago punk rock music community who had converted to Islam. And I had been interested in religion in general, but they were the ones that sort of introduced me to Islam and took me to an Islamic bookstore on Devon Street in Chicago, which is like the Indian-Pakistani street in Chicago. And they had an Islamic bookstore and got me a Quran and some other books. And so that's sort of how I ended up here today. In a nutshell.
Very cool, very cool. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you do today?
So I just finished my PhD in Islamic studies. I focused on how Muslims perceive the Hindu tradition, both historically and in the present. And so I wrote a dissertation about one particular branch of the Hindu tradition that came out historically 500 years ago in the Bengal Sultanate, so under Muslim rule. And now it's a global tradition. It has converts from all over the world. So I sort of use that as a way to explain how the Hindu tradition is still growing and changing and evolving. And, some of the things that Muslims said in the past about the Hindu tradition are very interesting, but not necessarily always relevant to today, where, Hinduism is now a global tradition that, in a city like San Francisco also has temples that has converts who are probably telling their conversion stories to Hinduism.
I see.
That's really interesting. So did you grow up as a Christian or atheist, or
Yeah,
how was life growing up?
I grew up in the Protestant church, sort of in the liberal side of the Protestant church. And the church that I went to was right down the street from my parents' house. And so we go to Sunday school every Sunday, and I was in like the youth group. And to make a long story short, different churches have different traditions. In my church, I was baptized as an infant, and then you have something called confirmation, which is where you confirm like the grace of your baptism by being an adult who then says, I believe in this. So I went through the process, and then they had a creed called the Apostles' Creed, which is the sort of simplest, oldest, most widespread form of, a Christian aqidah statement. And so they wanted us to say that in front of the whole church. Like, I don't know if we had to memorize it or if we just had a piece of paper. But so we were in the classes talking about what each of the different lines meant. You had lines like, I believe that Jesus died for our sins, and he descended into hell for 3 days, and he ascended to the heaven. He sits at the right hand of the Father. And I was like, I'm not sure I believe in these things. So how can I say it? At the time, obviously, I didn't know about the Shahada, but I was sort of saying I'm not ready to take my Christian Shahada. And so my parents and the minister were talking with me about it, and were comfortable with me not getting confirmed. So I was the only one in my class. I don't know, maybe there were 30 other kids that didn't get confirmed.
This was in Sunday school?
It began with Sunday school, and then the youth group I think was on a Wednesday night, and that's when we would do the confirmation classes. And then we had retreats and stuff we would do and things like that. But this was when you would officially become a Christian, join the church, and so I opted out.
So you never confirmed?
Mm-mm. So that's sort of one of when people always ask about the idea of qadr, the divine decree, I always feel that was something in my life that it's like, why did I feel like that? I don't really know. Like I wasn't like necessarily interested in theology before that. So, but at that moment, there was something in me that just kept me from wanting to say it. There's this story in some of the hadith that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was going to go to this like kind of raucous wedding party, and then he got tired and he took a nap, and then he missed it. And people sometimes say that was like one of the ways Allah protected him. That maybe something would have happened at the wedding party that would have been inappropriate for a prophet to be, participating in. But so Allah sort of intervened and protected him that way. So that's sort of how I understand it for myself, is that for whatever reason Allah, kept me from doing that.
That's really interesting. I like that. So you mentioned that you grew up or you were born in Chicago, right? And you also mentioned something about the punk rock that introduced you to Islam, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your life growing up in Chicago? I know you already mentioned about the Sunday school and the church, but what about that punk rock? What happened there?
Well, I think I was like an all-American kid. I don't know what age things started to change, but like early teens. So like when I was like a kid, I like loved the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan, and I loved college football and March Madness brackets, and I played sports, and I was a Cub Scout, and I, ate apple pie and hot dogs, but then, there were these kind of moments where like things started to shift. And so like, I think that the confirmation class was one of those types of moments. Then I think my mother had wanted me to learn how to play piano. She was kind of learned classical piano when she was younger. So that was my first exposure to formal music training. And then I just kind of, one after the other, I learned other instruments. I learned some piano. I ended up learning saxophone for a little bit. Then I learned drums. And the real kind of moment was that when I became interested in drums, there was like an easier connection to like rock and roll. And so I wanted to have like my own bands. And then when I was in sixth grade, I think it was, one of my friends got an electric guitar, and like all of us after school wanted to go see his electric guitar. And we're sitting in his bedroom, and I was like, let me try it. And I made up a song like right away. Like there's a thing called a power chord in guitar where you have like one string, here, and then two strings up. Called two frets up. It's like this. So and like most of like rock and roll and like punk rock is like all just moving power chords around basically. So, but if you just press your finger on the second fret on one string and then strum it, you make like a mini power chord if you just go up and down. Anyway, so it's like the simplest chords. So I liked Guns N' Roses at the time, and they had like a distinctive style of singing. I'm an old man now, so it's like classic rock. But so I figured out how to do three chords. It was like dun 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 dun, and I was like, I'm out of control, I'm losing my mind, I'll be insane till the end of time.
Oh,
And they were like, oh my gosh, you just made a song and it sounded like Guns N' Roses.
That's it.
And so I was like, oh man, maybe I could like play guitar. So then for my birthday, I asked my parents if I could get an electric guitar. And so then I just like taught myself by listening to rock and roll, like listening to music and like trying to figure out how to play it. And I had like a book that explained the other basics. So I knew the basics of like how music worked from my piano. And then this explained how I could do it with the guitar. So I just kind of figured out how to play it myself. And so from there, like, just you get in the way that like I would say like a lot of kids like who grew up the way I did, like you get into one thing which leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another, which is part of the challenge, like the moral challenge, is that like sometimes things progress in a negative way. Like no one starts listening to like satanic black death metal, like right away. Yeah. They start with something much more soft, and then it gets, you know what I mean? So by the time I went into high school, I had all these like connections to like more like underground music, and like I had a friend who was a sophomore and he had a car, and we would go to like all these concerts in Chicago with my friends. So my friend group was like all these kids who were into punk rock and what we called hardcore music, which is sort of at that time was music that had a very like strong political message, and also there were some bands that were very religious, and so that's sort of partially how I got interested in religion. And so, anyways, some of the older kids from my high school, who I was connected to. One of them had converted to Islam when he went to DePaul University down in the city. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. So he went to DePaul, and he met some Muslims, and then he took his Shahada, and then so through him it was like then another person in the scene became Muslim, and then I had heard about this, so I was interested in religion in general, and so I just like wanted to talk to them about their faith, because like it was like my only connection to Muslims. Like I literally did not know any Muslims at that point in time. So.
Wow, that's cool. That's cool. And then so. You went to talk to them, right? And then what did they tell you?
Well, so the first meeting was actually quite funny. We met at some Middle Eastern restaurant in the city of Chicago. And all I remember from it was that I couldn't understand what one of the guys was saying, because he was saying all these things in Arabic. And I realized like that, like later on, I realized it was because he was using all of the like things that you use in Arabic, like after you say, so I don't know what he said, but it was something like, then Jibreel alayhi salam said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, who told Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari radiyallahu an that at-taqwa is the pillar of the deen. Like so, like what did I get out of that? Like told Muhammad deen pillar. Yeah. Okay, there's something going on here, but otherwise I have no idea what you just said. So. I think he was trying to be very like doctrinaire in terms of how he was explaining it. So I was like, okay, whatever. Like, can you guys give me some books? And so they're the ones that took me to this bookstore. And it was that was really, I bought a Quran and a couple other books, and I read them all in like a week. And I was like, it was the first time I had read about a religious tradition where I thought, okay, this could be true. I think other traditions, I would read them and like, it's really interesting and some beautiful things in it, but it just doesn't seem like it would be true. Whereas Islam was the opposite. It's sort of like, this seems like it can be true, but let me give it time and see how far it goes.
So when they bought you the books and you converted to Islam, what branch of Islam do you convert to? Was it just like a sort of general Islam? Was it Sunni Islam, Shia Islam?
Yeah, I think at the time, I just thought I was entering Islam, right? And then because of my further studies over the years, I was able to like see how things develop historically and how there's these different understandings. So what I think what I converted into was a sort of, sort of conservative, Salafi, Islamist, kind of version of the faith. And like, somewhere between like sort of moderate Salafism mixed with like, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, mixed with Jamaati Islami in Pakistan, this of Maulana Maududi mixed with, whatever was happening at ISNA, Islamic Society of North America at the time, in terms of like the, Maulanas and ulama that were kind of popular then. So and there was definitely like a very political edge to it. A lot of like discussion about like the fight in Chechnya against the Russians, or in Kashmir against India, or in southern Philippines and places like that, or Palestine. It was almost like that you had this idea that there was like this one ummah, and then there's these like little borderlands where there's like jihad going on, and that like that's the community that you're joining, and you're like wanting to be on the side of the Muslims against the kuffar, to put it very simply, and that you want to create an Islamic state with like Sharia rule and things like that. So and then there was also a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Party of liberation, that is still around. It was just sort of like meant to bring back the Sunni caliphate. So, like, for example, I remember very distinctly the first time I went to the DePaul, like, it's called Ummah at DePaul, United Muslims Moving Ahead. And the first time I went to their, like, Muslim room, the Ummah room at DePaul, there was a poster on the wall that said there was some hadith from Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that was something along the lines of, like, there will be a righteous caliphate, and then it will devolve into, kingdoms, and it will kind of all fall apart. But then at the end of time, like, a righteous khilafah will reemerge or something like that. So there was a lot of that, that was part of it. And, I sort of half joke that, like, I was blessed to have converted earlier, because if I had converted, like, right before, like, ISIS came out, I would have been really confused, because I would have been like, all that rhetoric, would have been like, is this the right thing? So, but at that time it was much more like just theoretical. There was no, like, practical steps that one could really take.
I see.
Interesting.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit? So, backtracking just a little bit, right, about the books that you read.
Mm-hmm.
So, as you're reading and as you're exploring this concept of Islam, what was the one thing that, like, sparked for you that said, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and take a step towards Islam?
I think for me, there were sort of two related concepts. I may not have used these terms at the time, but looking back, I think it can be boiled down to simplicity and authority. So, like, now we have this, like, I understand the concept of a hujjah, right? That God has to, like, do his part to provide a proof to humanity to make them feel like, they have to do this. So I think that's what I felt. But it was the simplicity of it, right? Okay, you have this one person, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is he or is he not Rasulullah? Is he a messenger of God? Right? And there's 124,000 of them, so it's not to say that, like, he's the only one. And I remember even some of the discussions I had with people early on before I became Muslim was about, like, well, how come the Quran doesn't talk about Native Americans and, like, the prophets that were sent to the Native Americans? But the Quran does say that, there were many prophets, and that even the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't know all of them. It wasn't his responsibility. And so the principle was there that, like, guidance from prophets was universal. But in practice, you only really have to answer this question, like, is Muhammad Rasulullah? Because all you have to do is say, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And then obviously, La ilaha illallah is very straightforward, right? Anyone who understands the concept of monotheism finds that to be, about as succinct of a way of stating that belief as any other. And then there's, like, the Quran is, like, the nexus between the two. Like, that it's, it comes historically from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but it is kalamullah, it's the words of God. So by accepting the Quran, you're accepting God, and accepting Muhammad and accepting Allah, you're accepting the Quran and accepting Muhammad, and they all kind of work in tandem. And so then what's the point? Well, the point is, like, surrender, right? This idea that, like, God is telling you that, like, this is what it's all about. This is what existence is. Like, I want nothing but good for you, but you got to, like, do your part. You got to, like, come around and, like, acknowledge that this is the reality. And not this is just the reality in the 7th century Arabia, but this has always been the reality. And that's why there's 124,000 prophets, because one guy can't do the job of everybody. He just happens to be the one that you have to affirm, right? You weren't born in the time of Noah or of Moses and Harun or of Ibrahim or of Isa, peace be upon all of them, right? You were born in the time where Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the one that you have to acknowledge. And so it was, like, very clear. It's like, I either, like, accept him or I reject him, and then the Quran is, like, I always say that, like, if they had another line in the Shahada, like, wa ashhadu anna al-Qur'ana kalamullah, and I bear witness to the Quran is the speech of God, like the ummah would shrink, because you have one more, thing to say, right? So by having the Shahada be two simple statements, like, it opens the door very wide for people to just say, okay, well, am I on that side or am I not on that side? And then everything else flows from that. And so, for me, the real pivotal moment was I a camp counselor, and I was me and another guy were leading 16-year-old boys through the wilderness of Canada for about 2 weeks, and I had brought my translation of the Quran with me. This is the summer of 1998, and I would just read it by like the lakes and the streams, and I felt like what the book was telling me was like the same thing I was seeing in the ayat, the signs of nature, and so I felt like a great harmony between the two. And so it was sort of the same kind of spiritual but not religious feeling I felt when I was in nature, which was definitely the greatest sense of spirituality that I always had prior to becoming Muslim, was very congruous with the Quran. And so that was the moment when I really I was like, I think I want to be a Muslim. But then it was like a couple months until I actually took my Shahada afterwards.
That's interesting. What were some challenges that you faced? Like, obviously, your parents were, you said Christian, and then most of your friends were Christian. Everywhere you grew up as a Christian, like, what were some challenges you faced, like, converting to Islam?
Well, as I said before, I was already really interested in studying religion. So, like, I knew I liked studying religion just as much as I liked skateboarding. And so studying religion came very naturally to me, so that wasn't a challenge. So I could just throw myself into like anything and just like go into any temple or any space and just be like, what's this all about? Tell me what so that's just how I was. But then the question was like, is it for me, right? Because I don't know, maybe as like a white American guy, it's like easier to like do that, to just like show up in other people's spaces and be like, oh, okay, what's your religion? Give me some books. Like, tell me what you believe. And they're like, okay, maybe he'll convert, And so that was easy for me. But then the question was like, well, I'm my own person and I have my own life and my own ways of living and my own values and my own culture. Why would I change any of that? And so I think that that's when the challenge came, right? Because then you start to acknowledge that, well, what are the basis upon which I live my life? Well, there's like America as a country and a culture, there's my parents, there's my town, there's my friends, there's my schools, there's my teachers, my coaches. Then there's like certain figures that I've never met but are influential, whether like Michael Jordan when I was younger, or Axl Rose when I was a little bit older, or I don't know, at that point in time, there's some, punk rock people like Ian MacKaye, the guy who founded the band Minor Threat. Like, what would Ian MacKaye think if I became Muslim? So you have like all these voices in your head, right? And you have to ask yourself, like, well, do you feel like they have a better take on reality or this other thing? And it became very clear to me, that there was not, like, in the African American community, for example, there's like elders, and there's mosques that have been, there for decades. That if someone is, in the year 1998 thinking about becoming Muslim, they have all these resources to turn to. If you're like a white person, there's literally like nothing. I mean, I don't know, maybe now like you can go on YouTube and you can like look for like videos by Hamza Yusuf or videos by Suhaib Webb or other white sheikhs that like, talk about Islam, and it would be very different. But for me, it was, that didn't exist back then. So it was just like, there was kind of Islam and this a set of options, and there was like my world, and there was like really those guys who were in the punk rock community were like the only nexus between the two. So then you have to have a real strong sense of self and a real deep conviction if you're going to convert under those circumstances, right? Because it's just an idea. It doesn't really exist in like social reality. It's not like there's a mosque right down the street. You can be like, hey mom, like there's the mosque. You can go talk to the imam. They were just like, I found out later that my parents were worried that like I was going to like move to Saudi Arabia, like because they didn't know what it meant. I had no clue. Like, well, Islam, like, okay, we know that there's Muslims in Saudi Arabia. Does that mean he wants to like leave us and go live in Saudi Arabia for the rest of his life? And so I think those were the greatest challenges. And then I think, I'll say, without getting into the details, I think the other, great challenges was, relationships. I had a girlfriend at the time that I converted, and I had some other girlfriends like in the process between when I first discovered Islam and that. And I think there was definitely like an interplay between like, what do I want, and there was a kind of back and forth in my head and in my heart about like my relationships and then like my interest in faith, because I wasn't like joining the faith for a woman, I was joining the faith for me and for God, right? And so then there was a question of like, is that what I really want, and what are the implications of that? So.
I like that. That's really interesting. So a really good point that you mentioned was like having that faith within yourself, being able to have that mindset where you think for yourself and think, is this good for me? Am I going to be able to do this, right? So with that being said, like if there was any person that's watching that was, for example, considering converting, right? Any piece of advice you'd say to them?
Well, I think that ultimately, faith is about sincerity. Especially in the United States of America, right? People can become Muslim and then be Muslim for 10, 20 years and then leave the faith, right? It's just part of the social reality. And so if you're going to convert to Islam, right, you have to find it within yourself, the faith and the drive to go through the process and to learn, because there's not going to be, a situation where, it's like even if you decided, it's too hard for me to be Muslim in America, I'm going to move to a country where 95% of the people in that country are Muslim, it'll be easier for me there. Like, the truth is, like, you could still just be like, I'm done, I'm going back to America. If you get married and you have kids, it makes it harder to do that. But there's actually people that have done that. They got married and they had kids and then they gave up. And then, they divorced their spouse and, they have Muslim kids, but they're no longer Muslim. Right? So, that's just the reality of the world that we live in. And that's, something that many people aren't fully aware of. But what that means is that, any step you take towards faith has to be from within your own heart. And it has to be done in a way that you fully own it and you fully embrace it, that you say, this is what I want for myself, regardless of the Muslim community even, right? For me, one of the great things about learning the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was to learn that someone who is far, far better than I will ever be was treated far, far worse than I will ever be by the Muslim community. And when I, first started to shed tears for Imam Hussein alayhi salam, like it was like, there was so much of those tears were for myself and for the different like struggles that I had had as a Muslim, like trying to fit into the Muslim community, or just different struggles that I had had or negative experiences that I had had. And I always say that Imam Hussein gave me my freedom, right? Because like he taught me that, I don't deserve to be put on a pedestal. I don't deserve respect. I don't deserve to be treated with kindness, right? In truth, I do, right? But like the reality is different, right? And so, yes, you're going to go through struggles, and sometimes even the community is going to fail you, right? But if your faith is for Allah, right, then you can stand alone at Karbala and, nothing in the world, even if there's 30,000 Muslims in the caliphate on the other side saying, you're wrong, you're going to be like, no. La ilaha illallah. And so, I think that, of course, obviously converts need a great deal of support, and it doesn't take the community off the hook from giving the best to help people, in that journey into Islam. But at some point, you have to recognize that your faith has to stand on your own 2 feet, and nobody else can give it to you. Not a sheikh, not a book, not a community. It has to be for you. So that, like, I always tell this story that, I had been Muslim for about 11 years, I think, when this happened. 10 years. And I went to this masjid in a city, and I just wanted to pray in congregation. So I went to this masjid and I prayed Maghrib. And then when the prayer was done, I looked to the left and I looked to the right, and it was just all older Arab men. And I just started crying, And I just like felt so alienated. I was just like, and I remember making this dua, and I was like, Ya Allah, if this is how it's going to be for the rest of my life, like, I'm okay with it, because I did this for you, you know, and it just means that like I won't go to the masjid as often. I'll just go when I say, okay, I want the extra reward for prayer. I want to like, the reward of saying salam to my Muslim brothers and sisters, but it's not really my space, like it's not really meant for me. And so, but I said, like, if you can give me something else to give me like a more robust social experience of being Muslim, please do so. And wallahi, like after that was like one of the best social years of me being Muslim. Like, all these people just popped up, like Allah answered my dua, and like I had such a wonderful time as a Muslim in that year. But then it ended, right? And I went back to like, people moved away or people made different choices and da da da. And so then you're back, being Muslim by yourself again. And when that happens, is always like a gut check for the convert to say like, well, why am I in this religion? Did I join it for, a husband or a wife? Did I join it for, a sheikh or a masjid or a community? Or did I join it because I really believed in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah? And I think that when we look at the stories of the people of the past, oftentimes it's this really big like socio-political struggle. Like the Prophet and the Sahaba were struggling against, the Quraysh, and they all had to like show up and work together and sacrifice for each other. And I think sometimes we expect that that's what our experience of Islam is going to be like, right? But I have learned over the years that many of people's experience of Islam in the United States of America, the struggle is a really internal one, which is that, they actually have a good life. They have safety, they have security, they have job opportunities, they have educational opportunities, they have well-being, they have a relative decent social order. There's some persecution, there's some difficulties, there's some political challenges, right? But it's nothing compared to, some great tribulation. So where does the real test come? It comes in your own mind, in your own heart, where you have to wake up every day and say, well, even though I can just do whatever I want, I don't have to do this. I don't have to be here in the masjid today. I could be just enjoying myself somewhere in San Francisco. But I choose to come here, and I want it because I want Allah.
That's really deep, yeah. Was there any advice you were given at a younger age, maybe before you converted to Islam, after you converted to Islam, that you want to share with the viewers today? Some few key takeaways that you want them to have?
It's kind of random, so let me explain. So I went to a boarding school, and I had one of the people who hired me as a camp counselor when I worked at the camp. He had also gone to the same boarding school in Massachusetts. And he gave me a piece of advice. He said, when you go to this boarding school, you'll realize that everybody eats in the same building, but there's 4 different dining rooms. And you'll quickly realize that each dining room has like a certain character. So like the jocks eat in one dining room, and the theater kids eat in another dining room, and most of the African American kids eat in another dining room, right? Like each group has their place. So he said, my advice to you is to eat in all 4 dining rooms, right? Because you want the full range of the experience. And so my advice, I brought that kind of spirit with me into Islam, and I just went to all sorts of different masjids, hung out with all sorts of different types of Muslims, so that I could like experience the diversity of the ummah and better understand, what this tradition was that I was entering, so that, hopefully I could, on one level, be part of it and really truly be part of, the whole ummah, and at least in spirit. But then in terms of what I choose for my own practice, I can choose what I think is, the best. Right? Like the verse of Quran that, the people who choose, ahsan al-hadith, the best of speech. Right? You can only, it's like they say, be a discerning shopper. So what does that mean? It's like you go online or you go to a store and you look at all the options and the different prices and the quality, and you look at the reviews and everything, and then you have the ability to choose something, that is really quality. But if you don't know any better, someone will say, here's this piece of junk for $100, and you'll be like, oh, okay. So unfortunately, sometimes that's how it works in the Muslim community, is that, people get fed a piece of junk and charged a high price. And for Islam to be successful, in the West, we have to, avoid that as much as possible, because, people have options, and they'll go elsewhere if they find something better.
Make sure to check out our upcoming episodes on all the major platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music.
This was the Journey Towers podcast, brought to you by your hosts, I'm Hadi and Alya Matkar, and we'll see you in the next one.
Take care.